Thank you, Maury, for the very generous introduction. And the Hazaka Baruch for all that you're doing for the OU and Klal Yisrael. I want to thank Jacob Gold for sponsoring the shiur and all my good friends at the OU, the president, Moshe Bain. Congratulations on the new appointment. I was given a topic to speak about, that is Tihyat HaMetim, which literally means the resurrection of the dead, Metim. I think it's appropriate that the backdrop of where I'm speaking today at Citi Field has the word Met. Superimposed all over this board here. So I appreciate that they made this special backdrop for my class today. And some will say that the team that occupies this building needs Tihyat HaMetim as well. That being said, very, very interesting topic. Be honest with you, it wouldn't have been my choice to speak about it. I never really went into it. But as a result of preparing for the shiur, I did come across some interesting things about this topic. First and foremost, as an introduction, Maimonides, Ramban, in a classic, it's a must-read, is Perush HaMishnayot, his interpretation to the Mishnah. He wrote a Perush to all the Mishnah. He actually wrote it in Arabic. Later on, they would translate it into Lashon HaKodesh, like many of the books of Rambam. As a matter of fact, many of the books of the old Sephardim were written in Arabic. When I studied in Lakewood Yeshiva, I used to spend a lot of time in the library. And I used to look at old books. And I found an old copy of Chovot HaLevavot of Rabbeinu Bachya, also written in Arabic, in the original. Of course, our families come from Aleppo and Syria, although I don't read Arabic, of course, but my grandparents were able to do that. Anyway, in this Perush HaMishnayot, it's in Masechet Sanhedrin. You could find it at the end of Sanhedrin. After the Gemara is finished, Rambam goes through the 13 principles of faith. You find an abridged version of them probably in your Sidurim. After Alenu L'Shabeach, it says Ani Ma'amin Be'unah Shelema, etc. And there's 13 of them. And we're told that we must believe in these 13 principles. The 13th of these principles, Rambam writes, Tihyat HaMetim. And then he writes two words, Uchvar bi'arnuha. He says, I'm not going to go into an elaboration of it. I explained it already, which didn't do me too much help. I thought he'd give me the Perush, so I had to go searching in other places of Maimonides' works to see exactly what he says about it. But what caught my eye is at the end of all the 13 principles, once a person accepts upon himself that he believes in these 13 yesodot, foundations of Judaism, and his emunah becomes conclusive, now he has entered the ranks of Yisrael, of authentic Judaism. And now he gets all the perks of being Jewish. You have to love him. You have to have mercy upon him. All the amenities that you get by being Jewish, that one Jew must afford to his friend, if he believes in the 13, he's part of the group. And then he writes, and even if he commits other sins, because he has lust, which means, Rambam is telling you, if you believe in the 13, you're in. And let's say a person believes in the 13, but he eats cheeseburgers. He can't control himself. It's something that he hasn't conquered yet. Or he speaks Lashon Hara, terrible sins. But Rambam says those sins do not cause you to become a defector. A person has ta'ava, he has a desire, he cannot control himself, he's going to need to make teshuvah immediately, but he's still considered part of the ranks. Whereas, if he keeps all the mitzvot of the Torah, but he's in contempt of one of the 13, and I quote, mind you, this is Ramban that is touted to be the middle of the road, you know, Shvil HaZahav. He's portrayed to be the tolerant one, you know, and the one that has, you know, tremendous, you know, God forbid, in a liberal way. And then he comes along and he says, Aval, im nitkalkel le'adam yesod me'ele ha'yesodot. If the person, God forbid, has one of these principles become decrepit, harei yatsa ze min haklal, he has left the klal, ve'kafar ba'ikar, and he's considered a denier of the God, ve'nekra min ve'apikoros ve'kotzes benetiot. Why? You know, that's a word that you hear, apikoros. When we were in high school, you know, and our science teacher was telling us something about, you know, it must have been evolution or something. And we were kids, you know, and we were always told when you hear that word, you have to say the word, you have to say apikoros. So he started telling us about something, and we said, you know, apikoros. And the science teacher, I know what an apikoros was. I've been called that by, so no, we got taken back. But here Rambam says, if you don't believe in the 13 principles, you're an apikoros, you're a mean, you're a kofer, you have left the klal. And he goes on to say, u'mitzvah lesanoto, it's a mitzvah to despise such a person. And all the perks that we're supposed to get as Jews, he loses them. Even if he keeps all the taryag, he keeps kemach yashan, he eats only halav Yisrael, he sits and reads Tehillim all day long, he goes to shul with his talit over his head, he shakes back and forth, but that will not make him Jewish if he's in contempt of one of the principles, which means, I'm not going to go through all the principles today, obviously we came to talk about the Hayat Temitim, but this is a very important overview. You can't believe in something unless you know them. So I would say before you study the Taryag Mitzvot of the Sefer HaChinuch, you have to study the 13 principles of Judaism, and then you have to test yourself and say, do I believe in this? Is this something that is important to me? Is this considered one of my values? And it's not enough to believe. Rambam will tell you, you have to believe be'emunah shelema. It has to be a complete belief, which means one of these things he's going to tell you over here is, let's say, you must believe that every pasuk in the Torah was given by God and written, through Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu did not write anything on his own. Everything was dictated by God, and Moshe Rabbeinu only was the secretary to write down the word of God. That's a principle. And somebody comes along and says, well, listen, I believe in everything, but I believe this one word, in Sefer Bamidbar, Perek Lamed Bet, Pasuk Vav, the word et. It's an auxiliary word. That one word, I have a theory that Moshe added it. And he's wearing a hat, and he wears all the right clothes, and he has his seat sticking out, and he wears two tefillin, Nashi and Abenutam, and his wife sits home all day long baking challah, and doing all perek shira, and shira shirim backwards, all the stuff that people do that considers them religious. And he just says, I believe in everything. And he's devout. But he just says this one word, et, which is an auxiliary word. Doesn't make a difference here or there, really. It's just a filler word. I think Moshe Rabbeinu added it on his own, but besides that, I agree with everything. Harambam says he's a defector. He's considered out of the ranks with all his stringencies and all his religious, decor. He's considered a mean and a pikoros and a kofer. Wow. So again, I say there should be a movement in teaching the 13 principles of Judaism. And then there should be another movement to convince the student that these principles are binding and that we must believe in them in emunah shelema. Now, according to Harambam, these are not up for debate. This is not up for a discussion, do we believe in it or not? The 13th is Tehiyat Tamitim, that the dead at a certain point are going to be resurrected. Although he doesn't write it. He says, Kivar bi arnuha. So I searched a little, and I actually found great controversy. Harambam dedicated an entire letter. Rambam is known for his letters, his igrot. He writes an igeret, and he calls it the igeret on Tehiyat HaMetim. And what's the purpose of the letter? It's because he had a student in Damascus that got up in public and said, I studied Harambam's works, and I have concluded, based on Maimonides, that he does not believe in Tehiyat HaMetim. Harambam writes in this letter, originally I thought he's an outcast, this student, and I don't have to respond to every student that's going to misconstrue my words. After all, he's batel b'mi'ut, he's batel, he's nullified in the minority. I don't have to answer every person that's going to, misconstrue my words. But then he says, I was told that there's others that have made the same mistake. So he dedicates an entire composition, an essay, to defend his position. And he goes on to say, God forbid. Of course I believe in Tehiyat HaMetim. I wrote it in the 13 principles in Masechet Sanhedrin. And over there I said, if you don't believe in it, God forbid, Amin Apikoros. He said, but I know why they misinterpreted me. Because Harambam's opinion was that Tehiyat HaMetim, the resurrection, is not the final stage. Harambam believed that the dead will be resurrected for a certain period of time. The world will continue to exist as it exists now. Olam kiminhago holech. That's after Tehiyat HaMetim. The world continues. We eat, we drink, we conduct ourselves. It'll just be a more spiritual world, with Mashiach being the leader. And then at a certain point, everybody perishes again. And from there, we go to a different world that's called Olam Haba. And that's a world of neshamot, and that's where the Gemara says there's no eating, and there's no drinking, and there's no physical pleasure, and tzaddikim sit with crowns on their head, and they just benefit from Ziva Shekhinah, and that's the world of the Gemul, of the reward. So Harambam has two different stages. He has the Tehiyat HaMetim, which will last until whenever, and he doesn't like to go into details. Harambam himself says, listen, time will tell who's right and who's wrong on their positions on what's going to happen. We'll wait and see, and then we'll decide, because it's not a pivotal to Rambam to know the details of it. He says, if you deny the details of it, what's going to happen first, what's going to happen second, that's not going to make a person a kofir. But you must believe in the resurrection, when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen. Anyway, Harambam, his opinion was that Tehiyat HaMetim is the precursor to Olam Haba. So because he played it down, because he put something ahead of Tehiyat HaMetim, they understood Harambam was saying, he doesn't really believe in it. It's just straight to Olam Haba, and the resurrection is secondary. And from becoming secondary, it became tertiary, and from becoming tertiary, it became non-existent. So the students, of course, embellished Harambam's opinion. And the student has the brazenness to come along and say, and all those Pesukim in the Torah, in the prophets, that talk about resurrection, Harambam says it's only a mashal, it's only allegory, and it's only a parable. Harambam is very angry in the letter. He says, Has v'shalom. He says, of course, I do agree that certain Pesukim in Tanakh should be read allegorically. And he goes on to list some of them. He says, but the resurrection is not one of them. On the contrary, the resurrection is going to happen like the sun rises. And he says, woe to these students that have misinterpreted me, and I was clear enough that it should be understood. But nonetheless, then he goes on to explain it. And then he says, and if you suspect me for not believing in resurrection, go look at what I wrote in my Mishneh Torah. In Hilchot Teshuvah, in the 3rd chapter, Maimonides writes in his own words, these are the people that do not have eternity. They have lost their share to Olam Haba. Ve'elu she'en lahem helek la'olam haba. And he lists 24 different people. Rabotai, again, all party excluded, but I would recommend you to read that list as well. Just in case, God forbid, some of your friends that might... You have to warn them. Harambam is very, very severe. If you are part of these 24 groups, you're out. I don't care how much kemach yashan and how much halav Yisrael you're going to ingest. You're going to have a problem getting into the door. You won't even get into the door. And what's one of them? He says, hakofer b'tayat hametim. So he says, I wrote that if you don't believe in Tiyat HaMetim, you lose your Olam Haba. And this guy from Damascus is going to come say that I said Olam Haba is one big allegory, it's one big mashal. So let's put that to rest. Nobody should make that mistake in what Harambam's opinion is. Harambam's opinion is, it is a reality. You must believe in it. It's Pashuta Harambam. The only thing Rambam says is it's not the final stop on the train. And there's where Ramban, Maimonides argues. Ramban says, no, it's the final stop. Ramban says there's going to be a resurrection, and we're going to get reward, and all that stuff that they tell us in Olam Haba, it's going to be with our physical bodies. And it's going to be a world where we don't have to eat anymore and drink. God's going to, the body's going to become spiritual like the neshama, and you're not going to need all those physical pleasures to exist, and you're going to be able to exist through spirituality and so on and so forth. So there's a big argument here. Is Olam Haba in soul? That's Maimonides. Or is it Olam Haba in body? That's Maimonides. But everybody says there's going to be a Tehiyah first. There's a third opinion of the Ritva. I don't want to spend too much time on the opinions because, like the Rambam said, we could argue this from here to tomorrow, and then we'll wait till it happens, and then we'll say, the Rambam was right, the Ramban was right, and he'll be happy to concede to the Ramban because he says it's not important to know the order of things, to know the schedule, what's going to happen first, what's going to happen second, is going to be a world of souls. That's details. It's important to believe it's going to happen. What time on the schedule is going to happen? Immaterial, according to Maimonides. Ritva says there's going to be 2 Tehiyat HaMetim. Okay, there'll be a Tehiyat HaMetim in the times of Mashiach, and then everybody will go back down again, and then there'll be one before Olam Haba, they'll come back. Over there in the Gemara in Ta'anit, Kol HaMit'abel al Yerushalayim, Zoche v'ro'eh b'simchata. Look at that Gemara, there's a Ritva, and he goes into his theory as well. Now, what I struggle, if I were to be teaching this to college kids, let's say, they would have a hard time convincing their professor at Harvard or wherever they study that there's going to be a resurrection. Because that goes against, obviously, all science. How could we explain resurrection? If a body dies, there is no scientific proof that a body will, come back. It's dead, it's a met. But in college, they do accept precedent. If we could show a precedent, even if it's in a different area, but we could show the concept exists in some realm, so then you can't discount the concept and say, well, it's impossible. Well, if we could show a precedent somewhere else, we could then say, well, look, it happened over there, so why can't it happen over here? Just extrapolate a little and stretch your brains. I would say to the scientist or to the professor, well, if you go outside now and look at the trees, you'll see the trees look pretty dead. No leaves, no greenery, and they don't look like they have any life. This time of year, the trees are dormant. They have no fruits, and they are lifeless. But wait a few months, and all of a sudden you'll start to see the first buds coming out of the trees. Now, our rabbis established a blessing in the month of Nisan that when you see the first buds come out of a tree, you must make a beracha. And I always wondered, is that the most important thing, pleasure of life, that you must make a blessing on a new blossom? I'm not underestimating it or undervaluing it, but to go out of your way to find a tree or 2 trees and to make a special beracha, unless the Hachamim were trying to give us an imagery of what Tehiyat HaMetim is. And that tree that you thought was very dead, and that tree that you thought was lifeless, and that tree that you thought would never sprout again, you see the icicles hanging from the tips of the tree, and all of a sudden, you see a bud come out. That is Tehiyat HaMetim. It's not of a human being, but it's in a tree, and all of a sudden, a month later, there's green, and there's fruit hanging. And that same tree will die again 6 months later and then be resurrected. So in that sense, there's a precedent to Tehiyat Metim. The world, the nature of the world constantly goes through a hibernation during the winter and then resurrects itself. There's a resurrection during the spring. And I would imagine I could tell the professor also. By the way, not that I'm obligated to get into a debate with the professor. I could just say it's a miracle. But he doesn't believe in miracles, you see. If I were to tell him it's something against nature, they say, no, we don't believe. We cannot put that under a microscope. We cannot, we don't have studies on miracles. So they have to go a different route to convince him. I'm not saying anybody here needs to be convinced either. But I think it's important to know these talking points that if you ever come in contact with somebody that might be a little skeptical, and we don't want a person to remain skeptical, we want him to become a believer. So we have to try to make it easier for him to accept it. We have to make it palatable. Just that, oh, it's a miracle. Yeah, I don't believe in miracles. So if we could try to draw him closer to the principle by giving him examples from nature. Well, the other example I would give him is, if anybody ever planted a tomato patch. In the summer, we do it in Deal. We plant, tomatoes in our backyard. And basically, we take a seed, and we throw it in the ground. We bury it in the ground, just like we bury the dead in the ground. The seed is, we don't make a levaya, obviously, but we bury him in the ground. It's no ceremony. And I'm told, again, I don't know it to be, I didn't see it with my own eyes, but I'm told that the way the seed begins to grow is first it decays. The seed decomposes first. And when it finally reaches the level of decomposition where it's almost no longer, all of a sudden it starts to now grow. So every seed, before it grows, dies first to a certain degree. And then all of a sudden it grows. Now, the case of the tomato is even more incredible than Tehiyat Metim. Because Tehiyat Metim says one body is put in the ground and one body comes out. In tomatoes, you put one seed in the ground and you get a whole family of tomatoes. So if we wanted to see a mashal from, nature, as you say, there you go. Anytime you plant something, the fact that the ground is able to produce. Now, I'll tell you the fact. Why don't we get excited from that? Because we're used to it. So if somebody would say, tomatoes that grow, so no. Well, let's look at the reverse. Let's think in reverse. Let's say Tehiyat Metim was a natural event. Let's say that was the thing. People die, and then a month later, they come out of the ground, and they come back home again. Let's say that was a normal procedure. After people die, it takes a month, and everybody knows. Hang out in the cemetery, you'll see people popping up all day long, and they just go back home, and it's a month until they resurface. Well, we would be very used to it. Nobody would think anything of it. But let's say growing tomatoes was not. And somebody would tell you, listen, you could take this seed, put it in the ground, and in a month you're gonna get 50 tomatoes. Come on, don't what are you talking over here? It's all depending on what you're used to. So since we're used to this form of Tehiyat Metim of tomatoes, it becomes, Mother Nature, natural, expected. But if we would get used to the other one, so I think God gives us these examples in life in order for us to train our minds to get a little closer to the belief. I have a synagogue in Brooklyn. The synagogue is on Ocean Parkway and Avenue R. When I wanted to prove Tehiyat Metim to some of the college students in a Wednesday night class that we have, and again, some of them are skeptical, some of them are critical. They're taught critical thinking in college, to challenge everything. No problem. We have to have answers for them. So I said, boys, I'm going to prove you now Tehiyat Metim. And I pointed across the street from our synagogue, out the window. I said, right over there, you see it? And they're all looking. I said, look good, you see it? Now, right across the street from our synagogue in Brooklyn is a yeshiva called the Mir Yeshiva. Yeshivat Mir. I said, there you go. There's the Tehiyat Metim. There's your proof. I said, what are you talking about? Now, we're Sephardim, so we're not so keen on the history of, we wouldn't be able to find Mir on a map. But we know the history. You know the history more, I'm sure. It's a bad piece of history. When the Nazis came into Germany and Poland and all that region, Europe, besides the decimation of of humans, of the 6 million Kedoshim, Hashem Yimkom Damam, Amen. Besides that, I'm not minimizing that, but there was a concentrated effort to destroy the Torah of Europe. And they went from yeshiva to yeshiva, and they burnt it, and they tortured, and they burnt books. On the night of Kristallnacht alone, they burnt 1,000 synagogues. Not 1,000 steeples, 1,000 prestigious synagogues. And one of the yeshivas that went into exile was the Mir Yeshiva. With all its students, with all its books, with all its yeshiva. Now, if you went in Nazi Germany or Europe in the mid-1940s and you said there's going to be a resurgence of Torah and the Mir Yeshiva will flourish again, you say, do me a favor, do me a favor. It's an end of an era. Torah's never going to flourish in Klal Yisrael. It's past, it's dead. Hitler killed it. It's finished. He nailed the final nail in the coffin. Torah will never exist in America. You'll never have a Rosh Hashiva again. You'll never have studying of the Talmud again. And if I was around, I probably would have bet on the side that it's dead. And it's never going to be resurrected. I would bet more that an apple will grow from a tree after the long winter, but I would not bet that Torah would flourish again. And like a phoenix that comes out of the fire, today you have the Mir Yeshiva in Brooklyn, that's our neighbor, and you have 500-600 students coming in and out every day, studying Torah. And then you go to Israel and you have the Mir Yeshiva, that they call it over there, I don't know, there's 7,000-8,000 students. I'm just giving you an example in history where you see things are resurrected. Things that we thought are very dead and will never have another, spot on center stage, and they have reappeared and they have resurfaced. And some will argue, maybe not on the same quality, certainly not the same quality. There's a degeneration, but quantitatively, Torah has resurged and flourished again in America. So again, in history, you see Tehiyat Hametim. Again, that's just to make it palatable to the ear, that if I see it here, and I see it here, and I see it here, so stretch your brain, it can happen to the human as well. And now, I go back to probably the first person in history to ever introduce the concept of resurrection. Before him, I don't think it was well known. This man actually made a very, very bold purchase. And as a result of that purchase, he was making a bold statement on resurrection. And that is none other than Avraham Abinu. Of course, Avraham Abinu went to Ephron, who had a piece of real estate in Hebron. We know it as the Ma'arat HaMachpelah. The Ma'arat HaMachpelah is one of the holiest sites for us. I'm unable to go to Eretz Yisrael without visiting Hebron. I cannot, a trip is incomplete unless I go visit the graves of the Avot. As a matter of fact, I was just in Eretz Yisrael about a month ago, and I did something that I consider myself and my son lucky that we did it, and I never heard too many people do it. You know, when we bar mitzvah our children, most people bar mitzvah their children by the kotel. And it makes a lot of sense. I was bar mitzvah by the kotel in 1982. It's a great zechut, and I thank my parents all the time for that opportunity. But we all have such a connection to the Ma'arat HaMachpelah. My son Jacob just got bar mitzvah, Yaakov, and I told him we're going to take you to the graves of the Avot, and we made his bar mitzvah in Ma'arat HaMachpelah, Parashat Hayesara, the week that Avraham Abinu bought the cave, at the grave of Yaakov Abinu. And to see my son Yaakov and his namesake Yaakov, and you take a picture by Tziyun Yaakov Abinu, incredible, incredible. And you say this was bought, I don't know, 3,500 years ago by Avraham Abinu, and he paid a heck of a lot of money. So the Malbim on this piece comes along and says, what was Avraham doing? He says, in the olden days, they buried their dead, but temporarily, just until they decayed. And once they decayed, they would, reinter the body and take the bones and the whatever was left and just, discard them. There was no such thing as a cemetery. There was no such thing as a permanent burial. It didn't exist. Why would there be? If there's no afterlife, if there's no resurrection, so then burying becomes it's a non-event. Why would we waste money to bury something? It's waste. So yes, maybe out of respect, we just put it in the ground till it decays, but why waste ground? We would dig it up again and then discard it in the ocean, or just burn it, or cremation, which is very common to people that don't believe in resurrection. He says in those days, nobody believed in purchasing a permanent plot, and here comes Avraham Abinu. So Ephron says, here, take the plot, because he didn't understand what Avraham Abinu was. He says, take the plot, go bury your dead. Thinking that he'll bury Sarah, and then a month later, unbury her, and everybody lives happily ever after. And all of a sudden, Avraham Abinu comes and says, no, I want a permanent place. And it has to be prestigious. And Ephron is going to tell Avraham, what are you talking about? And listen to the Lashon of the Malbim. Lashon of the Malbim, he quotes the Midrash. How much ink was spilled on this episode? I mean, a lot of words written in the Torah about this purchase, although it could have been written in one pasuk. And Avraham went to Ephron and bought the Ma'arat HaMachpelah, but the Torah spills a lot of ink. So he says, why? He says, Ki ma she'ericha ha-Torah b'keniyah zu b'fratut. Why did it give the details of this transaction? Ki Avraham ishtadel bazeh. Avraham made an effort. Kedei lintoa belev ha'amim, in order to instill into the hearts of the nations Pina Gedola, a cornerstone. Mepinot Hadat, from the cornerstones of Judaism, Shehi ha'emunah behash'arat ha'nefesh achar ha'mavet, that the soul and the body will live on. Ubegemu la'atid sheyeh ben nefesh ben guf. Ki gam ha'gufim, also the bodies, yeshnei admat afar, that are sleeping in the ground, yakimu or yakitsu, will wake up beyom hadin. Va'atidim tzadikim shi'amdu bilbushehem, and the tzadikim are going to get up dressed. Dressed means over here not in physical clothes, it means their body. Their physical body will come back. That's going to be the clothes that they come back in. Their physical body will be reinstated. And he goes on to say that they believe, the goyim, b'nehet, shehashvu ki metim bal yehyu. The metim are not going to live again. Ve'en od din v'hashbon, it's over, there's no more judgments. Va'kivura ena siricha rak lefi sha'ah. You only bury somebody temporarily. Mishum bizayon. You don't want to embarrass the family by letting the body decay. So out of respect to the living, you bury the body till it decays. After that, they would empty out the grave. Avraham made sure that this was done in front of all the landsmen. And he gave a lot of money for this. Nityased etzlam emunah. They got the emunah of Tehiyat HaMetim. It's the first one to buy a permanent resident for a mit. And think about it. A lot of the rituals that we do, including burying a met in shrouds. Why would we bury in shrouds? I don't think there's a dress code 6 feet under the ground. Sini'ut, 6 feet under the ground, I don't think even the most strict of poskim would say, under the ground there's no rules. So why do we bury in shrouds? And the Zohar Kadosh clearly writes, because at Tehiyat HaMetim we believe that when they come up, at least they should have something that they're wearing. There should be a dress. So just that simple practice of tachlichim implies to us that there's going to be a time where these metim are going to come back. Now I go into some detail of it. I found an incredible Zohar Kadosh. The Zohar Kadosh writes that there's a certain bone in the body that is so strong, it's like kryptonite. It's unable to decay. Where all the limbs in a person's body are not free from decay. They can decay into dust. But there's one little bone in the body that remains forever. The Gemara actually calls that the bone of luz. Lamed Vav Zayin, the luz bone. Another place calls it actually the naskoi bone. And the Zohar Kadosh writes a different name for that bone. That's what I want to read to you. The Zohar Kadosh writes that there's a certain garmad de shidra, a bone in the spine. Hahu de ishta'ar bekivra, it remains in the kever, the grave. Mikol gufa. Everything decays except this bone. And its name, Betuel Ramma'a. Uh-huh. It's called Betuel Ha'arami. Remember Rivka Imenu? So Rivka, her father, Rivka bat Betuel. So the Zohar Kadosh, when we see Betuel, oh, we know that's the Shylock. That's Rivka's father. That's, Lavan and Betuel, two tricksters. But when the Zohar Kadosh sees the word Betuel Harami, it sees this bone. And it goes on to say that this is the bone where resurrection will begin. And it gives you the details. It says this bone will remain. And God will take a certain dew, tal, because you need to make a dough. You have three ingredients. You have the bones that decayed. You have the bone that didn't decay, the loose bone or the betuel bone. And now you need water. So there's a certain water that's called the tal of Tehiyat HaMetim. The Zohar Kadosh in another place says, where is that dew come from? I don't know if you can accept it, but this is what it says in the books. When a person learns Torah, there's some saliva, especially if you're in the front row. There's some, the splash zone is in the front row. There's some saliva that comes out of the mouths of the tzaddikim when they learn. And they say that that's the liquid that God uses in order to resurrect, whatever that means. You say, well, Rabbi, when I learn I don't spit. You still have a resurrection. It's, scratch that from the Derash. I'm just telling you what I saw brought down in Sfarim. Anyway, it says God's going to mix all the components together, and from the loose bone, the rest of the body is going to form. So that bone is integral. Where is it? When we were in yeshiva, we were young, they told us the top of the spine. Okay, if that's it, then I accept. I'm not an expert in the anatomy of these bones here. You'll have to ask your, bone doctor, wherever it may be. But nonetheless, there was a great rabbi called Yavetz. Yavetz, Yaakov Emden Bar Tzevi. He authored his own Sidur, called it Bet Yaakov. It's a great Sidur because it gives commentary. And he has commentary on Motzei Shabbat, introduction to the Seudah of Melaveh Malka, the fourth Seudah. And in this paragraph over here, he says, I quote a little, he says, Kishra'iti besefarim, I looked in the books, and I see Devarim, Odot ha'etzem haluz shel shidra. I see all this lose business. V'yesh shekar'u naskoi, and some call it naskoi. And then he says, it says in the books, she'eno nehene mishum achila ki im mizu ha'seudah shel motzei Shabbat. Oh. He adds a fact that bone gets no nourishment from any food that you eat. The only nourishment it derives is from the food that you eat in the Melaveh Malka Seudah Revi'it on Motzei Shabbat. So he goes on to say, Ve'amru, and they say, Shemimenu binyan guf ha'adam. And they say that the human is going to be resurrected from that. Ve'achu lebadon nishar b'keber. And it's the only bone that remains in the grave. אחרי ריקבון, after the decay of עצמות הגוף. כי ממנו תתחיל התחייה. The resurrection will begin from the luz or the naskoi bone. ויותר מזה גדולה, he says, and even more shocking, כשלמדתי במדרש, and he quotes the Zohar, שנקרא בתואל רמאה. It's called Betuel the crook. Ve'amru, and they said in the Zohar, Shehu Rama'a, because this bone is a crook. Lefi she'eno sobel ta'am mezonot, because it doesn't eat. It's a crook, he explains, because all the limbs eat. And when you're eating during the week, this bone gives the impression that it's benefiting, but it is really not benefiting. It is only benefiting from what's eaten on Motzei Shabbat. So it's a ramai. It behaves like all the other limbs. It gives the impression like it's like everybody else that doesn't want to stand out, but it's a ramai. Because when it's in your body, it doesn't really benefit only from one meal a week. And then he says, he says, when you see this Zohar, you are nothing less than shocked. What is Betuel? What is Ramaut? So he goes on to say, he says, you know why it's a Ramai? It's a Ramai when you're alive, and it's a Ramai when the person's dead. When the person's alive, it gives the impression like it's everybody else, but it really doesn't have any nutrients except Motzei Shabbat. And when the person dies, it gives the impression like it's like every other bone, but it's really not, because it doesn't lend itself to decay, so it's a Ramai. He says if you take the word Betuel, the numerical value of Betuel is 439. The numerical value of Met, Mem Taf, is 440. So he writes, it's one less. Betuel is one less than Mitah, because it does never reach Mitah. It never reaches death, because it's excluded from Mitah. So Betuel, the Met -1, as we'll call it. So the way the Torah calls that is Betuel. Haramai, the trickster. Where did it trick? He says that when death came to the world after Hava and Adam ate from the tree. I say Hava because she ate first. But nonetheless, Hava and Adam brought death to the world by eating. And it says that that poisonous food that was given to them went into all their limbs. But good news, when did they eat it? They ate it Friday afternoon. Good thing they didn't eat it from Alava Malka. They ate it Friday afternoon. So all the limbs benefited, but the limb of the luz did not benefit from that avon. And therefore it was never subject to the sin of death, because it never got involved in that. And therefore that's where the resurrection, it never was subject to the het of Adam Rishon. So it's a Ramai. It tricked the snake. The snake said, if I can get them to eat it, it'll go through all their limbs. And after they ate, the snake says, and the Neskavi or the Betuel Haramai bone says to the snake, to you. All that you gave us to eat, this bone is free from it. And then he comes along and says that this Betuel Haramai, the reason why it only benefits from Motzei Shabbat Seudah is because it's the only meal during the week that a person eats l'shem shamayim. Most people would skip the fourth Seudah of Shabbat, especially in the summer, exactly. We eat Seudah Shlishit at 8:30 in the synagogue. At 9:30, nobody's interested in having a lavish Seudah, washing for bread. So he writes, when a person makes the extra effort to go wash from a Lave Malka, that is eating it only because the Torah says you have to eat it, or the rabbis, or however you want to learn. You're eating it only for the sake of mitzvah, so it's a spiritual eating. So when people come to Lave Malka and say, I can't eat, that's the goal. If you feel like that, you've succeeded. Then the Neskavi, the luz bone is going to take a big portion in it. And that's why our great rabbi called Ben Ish Hai, he has a very important dirash on the Melaveh Malka. You see, we could talk about Tehiyat HaMetim from here to tomorrow. My purpose is, you believe in it, everybody believes in it. So you're part of Klal Yisrael. You know the mahloket now? Basically, you know the mahloket. You know the ramifications if you don't believe in it. And now you know where it's going to start from. So then what does this class mean? We came to talk philosophy then. But no, there's a halakha ma'aseh that comes out of this. If you believe in all this, and you believe that the bone, that resurrection begins is the lose, so you have to accept upon yourself as a result of this class of Tehiyat HaMetim, not anything else but to eat Melaveh Malka. That has to be the takeaway. So what did the rabbi talk about? Leave the philosophy, Ramban and Rambam and Ritva and when and how, and all that stuff. Like Rambam says, when it happens, we'll see who was right. But what does it mean to me today? How does it impact my life, this talk? Impacts the life is next Motzei Shabbat, when the Yetzer Hara comes and tells you, nah, don't wash, don't eat, pass, skip it. No, this is not a meal for the stomach. On the contrary, if your stomach is not in the mood, that's when the meal is actually even more valuable. So the Ben Ish Chai, our great rabbi, the Ben Yosef Chaim in Baghdad writes, and I'll conclude with this. He says on the Pasuk, V'hineh sulam mutzav arza, v'rosho magia hashamayma. He says the ladder in Yaakov Abinu's dream, he says, V'hineh sulam, the ladder, mutzav arza. It was on the ground. Well, I guess the legs of the ladder are on the ground, but rosho magia hashamayma. He said there's certain things in life that people mistreat them. They're mutzav arza, they're thrown to the ground because they don't realize their real value, but their real value is rosho magia hashamayma. And what is one of those items? Sulam. What is sulam? He says sulam is an acronym. Se'udat levayat malka. He says the se'udat levayat malka, that's sulam to most people, mutzav arza. It's mistreated. It's not given the proper credence. It's not given the proper value. But rosho magia hashamayma. And if we believe in resurrection, one of the ways you could prove it to your children is by having Seudat Melaveh Malka. That's the way you prove it. When you sit down and you explain to the kids, why are we eating this? In order to give sustenance to the loose boy. And then you explain it to them. And you explain to them this is the kryptonite in the human body. And we're giving it fortification. So when God resurrects, this same body will come back. What a lesson. And that's why we call it Seudat David. Because David Melech Israel, Hay V'Kayam. David represents this concept of Hay V'Kayam, of eternity. The blessing in the Amidah, the second blessing, V'ne'eman ata lahayot metim. Baruch ata Hashem mehayeh hametim. One thought. Halakha. If I have this cup of water here, and I am not sure if I made a berachav shakol. Well, in this case, it's easy. I'll ask, Rabotai, did I make a shakol? So you did not. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol yom baruch. But let's say I'm alone and I legitimately have a doubt if I made a barakah in this glass of water. What's the rule? Well, we have a famous rule, safek berachot lehakel. It's a rule, and the Sephardim we say sabal. Every time there's a safek, sabal. Rashid what safek berachot lehakel. A person comes out of the bathroom, chutz me'akavod. A person comes out of the bathroom, he doesn't know did he say asher yatzar or not. Safek. Sabal, Safek Berakot Lakel. The rabbis are so strict. If you have a doubt, better do not say the Berakah, because if you say God's name in vain, it's a very, very severe sin. One of the 10 commandments, Lo tisad Shem Hashem Elohecha lashav. The whole world shook when that commandment was given. And therefore the Hakamim are very, very, very cautious by allowing somebody to make a Berakah that might not be necessary. Halakha. I have the same cup of water. 99% I think I didn't make the beracha. 1% I think I did. Sabal, That's what Sabal is. Sabal is not only in the 50-50. Sabal is if you have the remote safek, doubt that you made this beracha, do not make it. Why am I telling you this? We make a beracha in the Amidah. Baruch atah Hashem mehayeh hametim. If there was a doubt that there's going to be resurrection, even if it would be 0.5%, the rabbis would say, listen, safek berachot la'akel. How can we say Baruch atah Hashem mehayeh? So when we say the beracha of Baruch atah Hashem mehayeh metim, the fact that we make a blessing on it shows that Chazal did not, it wasn't a 90-10 and it wasn't a 99-1 and it wasn't a 99.8.2. This was something that was a 100% conclusive, foregone conclusion that there's going to be a Tehiyah. That's something that can serve as a consolation to many people that have lost loved ones. It's the way of life. The greatest consolation is that it's temporary. V'ne'eman atah la'hayot metim, that these deceased, especially the good people, they will come back. And the Zohar HaKadosh says they come back in their prime. They leave all their disabilities behind. They leave all their sicknesses behind. All their ailments are behind. And they come back in a perfect specimen in the Yemot HaMashiach. Now, that has to be consoling. So Tehiyat HaMetim not only is a principle of faith, but it's a very important conciliatory way to tell people that, God forbid, lost somebody, that it's a temporary loss. Lehavdil, it's like somebody that went away on a vacation. Do we say that they're gone? Of course not. They went away for a few months, or a boy goes to study in Israel for the year. He's still alive. It's the same concept. It's a temporary departure, and that's why we don't say met. When somebody passes on, we say niftar. Niftar means, well, in modern Hebrew, niftar means he retired. Somebody retires from the bank. Niftar. Doesn't mean he died. He retired from life. There was one rabbi who passed away in Jerba, in Tunis, Sephardi rabbi. His name was Rav Hai Tayyib. If anybody ever was in Har Nof, you lived in Har Nof, so there's a road, Rehov Rav Hai Tayyib. Rav Hai Tayyib was a Sephardi rabbi from Tunis. He was a Gaon. Anyway, when he passed away, the guy who wrote the tombstone was an Ama'aris, and on the tombstone he writes, Po met Rav Hai Tayyib. Now we don't use the word met, because met implies final. We always use the word niftar lebet olamo. You know, if you look at the Pesukim in this week's parasha, v'shachavti im avotai, and I will sleep with my fathers. V'shachavti, it's just resting. We call the tzaddikim in Hebron yeshenei afar, those that are sleeping in the dust. We never use the word met. It's a heavy, met sounds like it's final. Anyway, the guy writes on Rav Hai Tayyib's grave, po met. So Rav Hai Tayyib comes to him in a dream and says, what did you do? We believe in Tehiyat HaMetim. How could you write met? Go fix it. So he goes, and again, Ama'aris is Amah. He didn't wake up a Tamir Hacham from that dream. He goes to the cemetery in Tunis. It's still there. I saw pictures of the grave. And he writes like a tree next to the word met, and he adds the word on top, lo. So it says, Po lo met Rav Hai Tayyib. That's what it has on his grave. And the truth of the matter is, he's right. When you go to a cemetery, we call the cemetery Bet Hayim, which is very interesting. So some will tell you, yeah, because it's Sagi Nahor, you don't want to say Bet Hayim, but it's wrong. It's Bet Hayim. Because Rav Chaim Vital, and I conclude again, I didn't see, am I missing the 5-minute mark? I missed it already? You forgive me. So much things happen in this press conference room. I'm a big Yankee fan. So I want to take advantage of all, to undo all the good news the Mets gave from this table, to undo it with my Divrei Torah. So I'm not done yet. Anyway, Rav Chaim Vital writes in in his sefer called Otzrot Hayim, in a shah that he calls Rapah. Over there he writes that when a person passes away, there's always something that's called Havlad de Garmeh. Havlad de Garmeh is there's a certain life that remains. 99% of the life leaves, but a certain life remains. There's some life in the grave, according to the Mekubalim. It's called Havlad de Garmeh. And that's why you could talk to the Niftarim and you could communicate with them, because that Havlad de Garmeh is enough life. It's like a battery that still has a little voltage, like a car battery that dies. There's enough voltage that if you spark it, it'll catch. That's called Havlad de Garmeh. So actually the cemetery is a Bet Hayim, that even 6 feet under, there's still life at that spot. And Be'ezat Hashem will be fulfilled on us the second beracha. V'ne'eman ata lahayot metim. Baruch ata Hashem mehaya metim. Amen.